This is a very new program. The DIMA Master, that's a Master in Democratic Governance and Democracy and Human Rights in the MENA region, that will soon be renamed the Arab Master on Democracy and Human Rights, just started last year. This is this second year of the Master, and I'm the program director for the first year in this experience. And the challenges here are really to match. We are talking about democracy and human rights, and in this region, democracy and human rights issues are really intertwined, maybe more than in others. Everywhere, of course, here intertwined, but here maybe most than other regions, and we will see why. These are the countries that's a member of not the MENA region, but the Arab countries. We are talking about 22 countries, from Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, going to Syria and Iraq. We are now, at the moment, the partnership is between the Mediterranean countries. So it's Morocco, Tunisia, and Lebanon and Palestine, and Venice is part of this partnership. Which are the main issues of the area? Authoritarianism is the first one, and conflicts, the second one. International issues, I mean conflicts more related to international geopolitical issues, and religion-related issues, and I will talk about what I mean with this. What we have to know here, all those countries, 22 countries, are very different in their history, and even if most of them are authoritarian systems, they are very different authoritarian systems with different historical roots and different realities today. So we cannot talk about this area as it was an homogeneous one, and we will see about authoritarianism, the main difference. Talking about authoritarianism, it entails in the region a lack of political freedom and pluralism, corruption, lack of civil rights, and repression. Most of them are police states, with the phenomenon of desaparecidos, what's very known in Latin America, and torture. For instance, in Egypt today, we know that we have a lot of cases of disappeared people, hundreds of cases of disappeared people. I want to see some details about the situation. Listening to Arabs themselves. Why? Because it's a very spread notion that Islam, or the question, is Islam compatible with democracy? You know? And we know that those countries are Muslim countries in their vast majority. It's not a real question. It's a nonsense question. In fact, it's just like questioning if Catholicism is compatible with democracy. And the issue is more how politics instrumentalize religion in those areas as well. And another idea, quite spread idea, is since Islam is not compatible with democracy in those regions, people don't want really democracy. And this is absolutely not true. It's not absolutely true. And my colleague Carine Lahoud will talk about Arab Spring and the result of it. There is an Arab Opinion Index that's published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies of the Doha Institute in 2015, found that 79% of respondents believe that democracy is the best form of government for their countries. But if we have a look at the democracy index, and well, we know that's not the Bible, but it gives just a quite fair overview about the global situation in the world, and it takes into account 167 countries. And in this index, Tunisia is placed between the flawed democracy. as Italy, for instance, and it's in the 57th position. It was in the 70th position last year, and it was in the position 144 before the Arab Spring, before 2011. So we see how democracy improved in this country, but unfortunately is the only one after the Arab Spring that can see improvements in democracy, real improvements in democracy. Then we have 4 hybrid regimes, that's Lebanon, Palestine, Morocco, and Iraq, where we have some democratic performances accompanied by some authoritarian realities. And all the other countries, so we're talking about 17 countries, are considered authoritarian regimes. Starting with Algeria, 118 place, and finishing with Syria. Syria is in the position 166. I mean, worst of it, there is just North Korea is the last one. But we have to consider that it's as well a collapsed state, so the situation is not a normal one. And what we can consider really the last one is Saudi Arabia, is the position 160, where we found really the most authoritarian system and the real lack of any kind of even facade pluralism or freedom of expression. Is very, very difficult. And always quoting the index, they write the 3 regions experienced a regression. That's quite interesting. That's Eastern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and North America. And with MENA recording the biggest decline. So if we have to look at the result of the Arab Spring, they're not really encouraging in the whole, in the general framework, not for some countries, things change. This is just to have a look about what we are talking about Saudi Arabia. I said they are very different, those countries. This is what's happening in Saudi Arabia and in the Islamic State. You know, everybody knows ISIS, I suppose now, the Neo Caliphate, and we see that blasphemy, acts of homosexuality, treason, murder are punished by death in both countries, Saudi Arabia and ISIS. Slandering and drinking alcohol, 80 lashes, or it depends on Saudi Arabia. Adultery, death by stoning, or 100 lashes. Stealing, amputation of hands, and banditry, amputation of hand and foot, and banditry, crucifixions. I will explain after why I describe this situation. Another interesting tool to understand the feeling of Arab people, the countries, is a publication of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that's called Arab Voices on the Challenges on the New Middle East. So from now it will be AV. And this is a first qualitative survey. It's not quantitative, it's qualitative because it's made on interviewing 105 experts from almost every Arab country. And what's quite interesting here is that among those interviewed, there are a lot of people working in the government or for the government. So their view is quite interesting about their feeling about authoritarianism and democracy there. Third question is, please rank the following issues in order of importance in the Middle East. And as we see, authoritarianism is the first one with 65%, and corruption, terrorism, educational deficiencies, unemployment, and underemployment, interference, regional conflicts, sectarians, etc. Question 7-8, are you satisfied with the relationship between the government and the citizens of your country? And why or not? Is yes, 4%, and no, 84%. And why? Egyptian male answered, where is there to be satisfied about? And the Syrian male answered, the relationship is based on fear and terror and the implicit rejection of authority by the vast majority of citizens. Question number 5, do you think representative democracy is a suitable form of government for your country? Yes, 80%, no, 6%. But there are 40% are not sure about which could be the most eligible system. And I think that this answer made by a Tunisian male is quite interesting for all us, because it says, representative democracy, which offers everyone the right to do and say everything and elect anyone to power, may drive us to populist dictatorship and some form of anarchy. And what's more interesting for me is he said we need to rethink what kind of democracy we need, away from already Western cat and paste concept and the outdated post-colonial authoritarianism. Why this is interesting? Because yes, of course, we have a cultural problem when we have for those topics and in the educational program of the DIMA. Because we can feel that, yes, there is a feeling, that maybe is the feeling somehow in Arab countries that democracy is a Western concept as well, and it could be something, a top-down concept. They already had experience of top-down imported democracy, as in Iraq, so it's quite debated what democracy is it being imposed, is to be accepted. And again, on the outdated post-colonial authoritarianism, why this is important as well, because we know very well that a lot of Western countries supported or still supporting authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. So we can feel contradiction in the aim and some practices. And I talked about Saudi Arabia before, because if ISIS is a big challenge for Western countries as well, but first of all for Arab countries, Saudi Arabia that apply the same and similar system of law is considered a moderate country by the United States. So we understand how difficult it will be to deal with democracy or authoritarianism in those countries. Another main issue is regarding conflicts. Of course, we have today Iraq, Syria, Libya, occupied Palestinian territory, and Yemen in a conflict situation. Today, we have in Iraq 10 million people in need. That means that 28% of the total population. In Syria, 13.5 million people in need, 74% of total population. In Libya, 2.4 million people, 39% of population. Occupied Palestinian territory, 2.3 million people, 48% of total population. And in Yemen, 21.2 million people in need, 82% of total population. That's quite enormous. These are the areas involved in conflicts today. That's Libya, Iraq, and Syria, this region, and Yemen, of course. So in total, we have 57.6 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, and a total of 5.2 million refugees fleeing the area because of those conflicts. And this is what it says about the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs about the region conflicts. Well, of course, violate international humanitarian rights and death, injury, deprivation, and these are the numbers. Syria, more than 250,000 people that have been killed. In Yemen, 32,000. Iraq, more than 20,000 civilians suffering from violence by armed groups. And in Libya, more than 4,000 people that have been killed those last years. About refugees and displacements, those numbers, this is a humanitarian crisis, enormous humanitarian crisis. And people abandoning their homes are seeking refuge in the Arab countries, and how we know in Europe as well. And here again, we know how difficult it is we know the position of Europe recently about refugees and the attempt to the externalization of the problem that makes things more difficult again for Arab countries like Lebanon, for instance, or Jordan, or Turkey is not an Arab country, it's a Muslim country of the region that's facing this very important problem. The result is that millions of people in the region require immediate life-saving assistance to ensure their basic survival. I skip because I know that time is not really, so we can. Other international issues, I mean that some issues that where local governance challenges are intertwined with geopolitical and international challenges that are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Western Sahara, and again the Islamic Caliphate, and some religious-related issues. Again, I come back to the fact that it's not Islam itself, but is how politics is dealing with Islam. So problems are related to the personal statutes, that's marriages, divorces, inheritance, and the fact that we don't have in any of those countries a civil, secular, personal statute. It means that you can have just a religious one. You must belong to a religion to marry, inherit, or otherwise you don't have a civil status. And this goes directly to the religious freedom. Is it possible to abandon or to change one's own religion? It's quite difficult. Laws are different in different countries. For sure, it's impossible in Saudi Arabia. Is it possible in Morocco? Is it possible in Tunisia? Is it possible in most of those countries, in Egypt? But then, if you move from Islam to another religion, or if you move from Islam to no religion, for example, to atheism, you will not have any civil status. We remember Nasser Abu Zaid that had to migrate from Egypt to Netherlands because he was accused of being apostate, to abandon Islam. And so this is one example. And of course, gender issues. Saudi Arabia is the most difficult country for women. Everybody knows this. But it's a very difficult country for everybody, for minorities, religious or ethnic minorities, and for men as well. There is no pluralism at all. We cannot call really pluralism this sort of administrative elections that they had recently. But it's a small step, but it's really. Between brackets, yesterday somebody complained because we didn't have women, but we are two women talking about the most difficult area to women's rights, so it's not bad. And minority issues, depending on Islam, but not just about Islam, because Kurds are, for instance, Muslims, but they suffer the same, so forget that everything is religious related. So why the Dima Master? It's quite clear. The situation is very difficult. And I go back to the Arab Boys survey. What elements would you like to see in any new relationship between the government and citizens in your country? And the answers are, some answers are accountability, of which there is currently none, Egyptian. To establish a new social contract based on building up the trust in all aspects, Algerian. A relationship based on respect for human rights, rule of law, and social justice, Lebanese. Allowing for real alternation in power, a Moroccan. So we see that is all around the region. We have the same problems, and we have a high demand for democracy. This is the main point. Again, our voices, 85% complain the lack of political pluralism in many Arab countries that has contributed to the extremist wave confronting the Middle East today and urgently needs to be addressed. So extremism and jihadism is a problem for the Middle East, but it's a problem for the world war. It's not just for the Middle East. And again, we know how Saudi Arabia is spreading extremist Islam. Again, it's no moderate country. So we understand that it's not easy to deal with the questions. Again, are you satisfied with your country education system? Why or not? And this is another answer that push us to implement this master. Are you satisfied with your educational system? Yes, 9%, no, 79%. What's interesting is the answer of a Moroccan male. It says, because the educational system is deliberately chosen by a state to maintain the current situation. So implementing DIMA master in the region, this master will move in Beirut, inshallah, in 2 years, not next years, but in 17, 18, how important will be for respond to the high demand for the education on democracy and human rights that we have in the region. Well, how can we do it? How we implement the master? We have now actually a first semester in Venice, and as I said, it will move in Beirut from 2017-18. And the second semester will be it's now in one Arab country, in one of the partner universities. The partnership, as I said, is composed by Venice, St. Joseph University in Beirut, Birzeit University in Palestine, Carthage University in Tunis, and Université Internationale de Rabat in Morocco, and Foscari University in Venice. And we enroll students from Arab and European countries. And this is the richness of the master, and it's very interesting to see how they debate about those issues, the issues I illustrated before about democracy and authoritarianism in the Middle East, but as well how Western countries deal with those problems. So we have in the first semester of the program, it's a multidisciplinary curriculum that offers courses in law, political science, sociology, and other fields relevant to the study of democratic governance and human rights. This was this year a very dense program. It was just on one semester, but it will be starting from next year, extend to 1 year, and will become a 1-year program. As I said, it's the new one, so we are improving it every year. So we are discussing about democracy, political philosophy, and Arab realities. So we can furnish some theoretical tools and an overview about the current situation in the region. So students can familiarize themselves with the conceptual aspects of democracy and rights, and acquire an understanding of values of democracy and rights as instruments of human organizations. And an understanding of the historical legacy and global framework of the current situation in the region. I skipped teachings, but then we discussed governance, rule of law, and constitutional process, focusing on the role of civil society and institutions devoted to promoting the considerations of this view. So the interaction between civil society and institutions. So they acquire or reinforce advancing knowledge on constitutional designs and on political role of civil society. Reform, evolution, and political change, because Carine will talk about our spring and how important was this moment to understand the actual challenges. So we discuss about political changes, not exactly transitions, because it's political science means something very precise. And students with this gain a better idea about how to evaluate developments in the Arab world in recent years. And last section is about international relations and global system of human rights protection. So we explore the relations between international relations and human rights, and international and regional human rights obligations, and national and regional mechanism of human rights protection. So women, migrants, children, religious and ethnic minorities. Second semester will be is on the field. So every Arab students go in another Arab country different from the country of origin, and Europeans as well go in an Arab country for internship and research. What about the impact? We don't know. We are still too young to know what this program will entail. And for sure, we know that more than 1/3, quite half of the students that participate to the DIMA program last year are involved in programs on human rights, working for international institutions. So we are now founding the Alumni Association and collecting information about further steps of this master. We hope that the impact will be useful. Of course, this is our goal. I finish like this.
And I'm really happy to have this opportunity to participate to these conferences and to give you my point of view on what's going on in the Middle East, especially since this process, this revolutionary process that was labeled as the Arab Spring, but we're saying today that it's more going like to the direction of a winter revolution or winter moment in this area. So I don't know if you are really familiar with this region, because it's really long and from Argentina and South America, but I'm quite sure that you have some idea on this region, and that is sadly known for its recurrent crisis, for a conflict, bloody history. So I will discuss today the issue of political change in the MENA, that are shaking all the region. And for me, it's a huge challenge to address in half an hour what's going on in more than 20 countries. So I will try to do my best and to be as much synthetic as I can. And let's start with the Arab Spring, or some other call it Arab Awakening. It was a sudden phenomenon. In some cases, it was violent. It was also unexpected for many experts who are working on this region, even though you had systemic changes that have already been agitating the Arab society for some time. So in 2011, people across the Middle East took to the street to demand political reform and social justice. The outcome of the Arab Spring remained for the moment really ambivalent. And the optimistic visions that we have for the future at the beginning, and it was prevailing during the first few months of revolution, are now obsolete. So the hope that the Arab world would have become democratic as quickly as Eastern Europe or South America did 20 years ago are not yet fulfilled. Now we are much more in this dimension of fears that the countries of MENA, that from Morocco in the west to Oman in the east, would sink into chaos one after another, and these fears are much more materialized nowadays. So this process of change, I try to be synthetic, went through 3 different phases. And I will base my arguments on these 3 different phases. So the first one is what I call it the revolution momentum. This is, I will explain why people rebel, why people decide to go in the street and to demand for political freedom. What are the root causes of this Arab Spring? Secondly, I will focus on this instant incomes of the Arab Spring. The first one was the toppling of the authoritarian regime in the 4 countries and the call for free elections. And the third phase is it will focus on this post-revolution period. This post-revolution period, I will discuss the issue of political gains, stabilization, or in the contrary, the counter movements that have been launched by the ruling system in order to establish their authority. So the first phase, why Arab people rebel? In December 2010, the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a Tunisian vegetable vendor in Sidi Bouzid, in south of Tunisia, set off the waves of protest that have been termed as the Arab Spring. Mohamed Bouazizi became the symbol of frustration and the sense of injustice and inequality and indignity felt by many people in this region. And it made possible to overthrow the authoritarian regime in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and brought together various groups which were dissatisfied with the existing system, like the unemployed, political and human rights activists, labor, trade union, students, professor, lawyer, and other person, to begin what we have called the Jasmine Revolution, that is the Tunisian Revolution. So this protest in Tunisia pushed Ben Ali. I have a picture of Ben Ali. Out to Saudi Arabia in mid-January 2011 after 24 years of power. And this protest in Tunisia produced a contagion, a domino effect that will shake the entire Arab world. The chain reaction toppled first 3 authoritarian regimes, the one of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, in February 2011, then came Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in late August 2011, but Omar Gaddafi was pushed out by the anti-Gaddafi's fighters who captured Libya, and they were backed by NATO military intervention, and the overturning of Gaddafi government marked the end of 42 years of power. And then you had the experience of Ali Abdullah al-Saleh in Yemen in July 2011. So this is the first effect, that is the toppling or the overthrow of authoritarian regime. And then the other effect is the unsettlement of numerous other regimes throughout the Middle East and North America, who met huge of contention or opposition movement for at least in 2011, and in some country it's still going on. So why people decide to confront their ruling regime? Why did Arab rebel? How a revolutionary a wave of social unrest is possible, especially in the Arab Middle East? In other words, how the Arab regime, that everybody thought that they were strong enough and resilient to any political changes, began to collapse one after the other. So there is no single cause behind the Arab Spring. The demands that were made by protestators were wide-ranging, and they also evolved as the protest movement developed. In Tunisia, for instance, protests began primarily to focus over economic frustration, injustice, and indignity, and then it grew to anger at corruption in ruling families and elite. So what are these factors? You have two kinds of factors. You have the domestic factors and you have the external factors. Regarding the domestic factors, you have numerous triggers that will lead to a mass mobilization. You have socio-economic factors and political factors that influence each other and strengthen each other. So let's start with the socio-economic problem that are recurrent problem in this area. And the socio-economic problem were among the root causes for protest and increased social discontent. So in these social economic problems, you have economic decline, you have unemployment, extreme poverty. For example, 1/2 of Egyptians is living on $2 a day or less. You have rising food price, you have inflation, you have the number of demographic structural factors, such as a large percentage of educated but dissatisfied youth within the entire population. So, deteriorating labor market condition, particularly among educated youth, an erosion of purchasing power, and the crisis of the welfare system, all these contributed to a growing tide of popular agitation in early 2011. Then you have the political factors. As Barbara explained, this region still suffers from bad political systems that are based upon corruption, state of emergency laws, lack of political freedom. There are no free elections, no freedom of speech. You have repression, you have regional, religious fundamentalism. So in 2011, all the Arab regime are either autocratic, republic, or monarchical autocracy, except Lebanon and Israel. So in this kind of political settings, there are few spaces for political expression. Public space is under a tight control of ruling regime. This ruling regime at the same time monopolized economic sector, financial resources, ideological resources also by imposing an official Islam that legitimized and maintained the existing system. And of course, they control military forces and security services that are called al-mukhabarat. Let's talk now. It's not working? Ah, okay. Ooh. So after these socioeconomic factors, wow, this is high. And political factors, it is important not to underestimate the role of technology, of the smartphone, the role of social network, Facebook, Twitter, I'm sorry, that have facilitated the communication between the protesters. Mass social protest would have been probably impossible because the regime control and the censorship on traditional mass media that are newspaper and TV, and also a huge control on traditional spaces of mobilization that might constitute a potential venue for contention, especially in this Middle East area that are the mosque. So let's talk now about the external factors. The main reason of Arab revolt are not limited to internal causes. So it's important also to add international causes, as the failure of the war on terror that was launched by W. Bush after September 11, the Iraqi war in 2003 that will lead to the toppling of Saddam Hussein Ba'athi regime. Saddam Hussein in November 2006 was found guilty of crime against humanity and was sentenced to death. And you have also this USA and European strategy of imported democracy. So all these factors will lead to a more destabilization or destabilization in the Middle East, especially in Iraq. The failure of this transition process that was imposed by US administration will be one of the leading and structuring causes of current terrorism nowadays in the Middle East. So secondly, the second phase is the outcomes, the direct and the immediate outcomes of the Arab Spring. And the elections are the second phases of this Arab Spring. As I said, the first consequences was the overthrowing of authoritarian regime that will lead in some country to electoral process. The Arab Spring has certainly resulted in change of regime in Tunisia and Egypt. The uprising against the Gaddafi regime triggered a military intervention by the NATO that drove the Libyan leader and his entourage from power, and Ali Abdullah Saleh finally surrendered in Yemen. So, however, in all this case, the ramification of regime change regarding state-society relations are still uncertain. Mubarak may be on trial. Gaddafi is dead. Ben Ali is currently enjoying the exiles in Saudi Arabia, like Abdullah al-Saleh. But the ruling elites that they have created, the state structure that they build, the powerful services, the friendly capitalists they nurture did not disappear when the despots were deposed. So the post-revolutionary transition in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya are unlikely to deliver on the hope that united the protesters in their struggle. The second element I would like to address is that the revolutionary momentum lead to a second phase in Tunisia and Egypt with the free first election. Balloting, as you know, is the only step in the democratic process. The hard part comes after. Vote and ballot are counted, and the hard part starts when when the constitution is being discussed. Without any surprise, the first national elections were won by the Salafi of Al-Nahda in Tunis and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and their affiliated. And this was no surprising, because these two main Islamist groups were the most consistent organized force, and they benefit from an aura of martyrdom because of their repression by the fallen system, and the aura of non-corrupted and straight people at the beginning, yeah? Then the thing has changed. So the demand for full citizenship, for the recognition of individual political rights, were a powerful unifying theme across the Arab Revolution. However, now that 4 autocrats have been driven from power, the crucial questions at the center of these transitions are as much economic, social as they are political. Furthermore, beyond a collective sense of endeavor and empowerment, the movements of the Arab Spring were not united by a concrete or programmatical agenda for change, for post-regime change transformation. The pressing demands for economic transformation will be sidelined, and the newly empowered and not experienced Islamist political movement will fight over secondary issues such as dress code, such as policing of morality, where they have clear position on this issue, but they did not deliver any hope or any meaningful change or prosperity or growth. So the final issue also surrounding the direct outcomes of the Arab Spring is the coherence of the old ruling elite and their ability to suppress or buy off the challenges they faced. In 2 of the 4 regime changes, the removal of Ben Ali and Mubarak, it was facilitated by a fracturing of the ruling elite. However, this left the armed forces in both countries intact and in a central position to influence the shape of transition. And I will come back to this issue in the third phase that will deal with the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Is there any stabilization of these political gains? Or in the contrary, are we much more in a new form of authoritarianism led by a counter movement launched by the ruling regime? So the Arab Spring has given rise to 3 broad sets of outcomes. The first one contains the majority of the states in the region and represent little or no change. From Saudi Arabia to Jordan, the ruling elite have managed, through adjustments to their ruling strategies, to stay in power and face down the protestators. The regimes have survived the challenge of popular protest, and you are seeing now a new round of authoritarian upgrading. The ruling elite set about a reassessment of their formula for continued rule. This involved nowadays adjusting the balance between the 4 pillars of authoritarianism that are legitimizing ideology, repression, payoff or cooptation, and elite solidarity. In Kuwait and Bahrain, for instance, the Al Khalifa and the Al Sabah ruling elite faced the most serious and sustained challenge in their rule in the Gulf regions. In Bahrain, for example, the revolution was aborted, was aborted 1 month after it broke out in March 2011, with the intervention of the forces of the Gulf Cooperation Council that was led by Saudi Arabia. The Saudis justified this direct military intervention, that was the first time in the history of the Gulf area, by 2 main fundamental security challenges. The first one is that the collapse of Bahrain will lead to the overthrow of the rest of Gulf monarchies. The secondly is that since the population of Bahrain is predominantly Shiite, a victorious revolution of these Shias in Bahrain would turn the country to Iran's step stool. And thus, their response in Bahrain was to unleash a sustained level of repression against those who were involved in the demonstration. Then the Bahraini government pursued without any mercy all form of dissent. And then in the second time, when the ruling elite primacy was secured, they embarked upon a de facto kind of national dialogue, and the population has become increasingly divided as the regime pandered the sectarian division as part of its survival strategy. Okay, so they use the sectarian conflict just to, I will come back to the sectarian conflict with Syria, just to calm down the protest. In Bahrain, like in Kuwait, the ruling family succeeded in dividing the ranks of the opposition by returning, as I said, to a stronger and tougher repressive measure, by buying popular silence through generous redistribution of oil rents, and by co-opting at the head of the states, namely at the ministry portfolio, some former leaders of the opposition. So what about now the second categories of outcome after the Arab Spring? So this category, it's much more problematic because it leads to civil war, and this is the pattern that actually is in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. So in Yemen, which is a southeastern neighbor of Saudi Arabia, with a population of 25 million in a state of absolute poverty. In Yemen, this Arab Spring represents a major security risk for all producers. So the Yemeni Revolution was in fact muted in the beginning by the petrodollar, and then the Saudi used this tribal division, and now, as you know, there is a direct military intervention in Yemen. So concerning Libya now, this country is plunged into a civil war. This country is struggling against terrorism. This country has two transitional and separate governments. The self-declared Islamist government that is based in Tripoli, and the Tobruk government that is legally recognized by the international community, which is at the Egyptian border. And finally, Syria. What about Syria? The Syrian revolution resulted in a civil war. So beside at the beginning of the opposition of the civil society against the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, now you have a new line of tension that oppose the Sunni majorities of the population against a coalition of minorities that is Alawite, Christian, Druze, Kurd, and some Sunnis also. And this sectarian tension is nowadays a fault line that crosses all the Middle East, and which Syria is becoming the epicenter. So this is the Shiite-Sunni, or this sectarian clash, is opposing on one hand what we call it the Shiite crescent, that is led by Tehran, and it's supported by Malikis in Iraq, by Assad in Syria, by the Lebanese Hezbollah, by the Shia population in the Gulf countries. And on the other side, you have a Sunni front whose principal leaders are the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, no, not Bahrain, Turkey and Egypt. So today the conflict in Syria is becoming more and more a global conflict. You have first UN intervention, you have secondly intervention, a direct intervention of foreign armed forces like the Russian, and you have also proxy war through financing opposition or jihadi groups, given the own agenda of each country that is directly or not directly involved in this conflict. would like to add something, that the regime of Bashar al-Assad is not really threatened by the revolt. The majority of the armed force have stayed loyal to the regime, and the defections have not escalated to a point that the state coherence is in danger. But however, unlike the revolt in the 80s, in the 80s that was facing the regime, today the regime had not the capacity to suppress the revolt. And he used this sectarian ideology to solidify its base among the Alawite community, and to rise the fears of radical Islam and uncontrolled violence. And it forced the other minority, who might not be at the beginning pro-Bashar al-Assad, to offer their support. The problem also in Syria is that you have an exiled organization that was formed and represent the opposition, and with mainly based in Turkey, and the name is the Syrian National Council. And the problem of this Syrian National Council is that it fails to establish a coherent or meaningful links with the revolt within Syria, and this Syrian National Council is highly fragmented. You had several attempts to, at the international level for mediation, but so far it didn't break the bloody cycle of stalemate. And one of the main consequences nowadays of this Syrian conflict is that millions of Syrians are fleeing their countries, that is divided between the regime, opposition, radical groups, and the caliphate of Islamic State Turks. Nowadays, you have around 5 million Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries. 95% have found shelters in Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, and around 7 million are internally displaced. This war in Syria provoked, sadly, the major humanitarian crisis since the end of the Second World War, with more than half of the Syrian population displaced or refugee. So finally, you have a third category of states that, what I said, peaceful, that are much more in this peaceful transition, but peaceful, take care of this word, after this regime change. The first country is Egypt. The Egypt democratic experiences ended in a military takeover and extreme state violence. It was the military that delivered the final blow to the Egyptian democratically elected new president, and who was Islamist, Mohammed Morsi. And they imposed a new general, a new military, and his name is Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who is now the new strongman in Egypt. So in conclusion, only Tunisia has produced a consensual constitution and a second peaceful transition of power. So to conclude, the rest of the countries in the Middle East nowadays retain the ruling elite they had before the Arab Spring. Successful revolutions are very rare indeed. The revolution led to a counter-revolution that was launched by the ruling regime. The expectation of change, the expectation for a better life, the hope of freedom are not yet met, and I'm not sure that they will be met in the coming years. And what could have been a process of transition to democracy is nowadays a return to stronger autocracy and a sinking of Middle East into the abyss of war and terrorism that are affecting directly the neighbor region, namely Europe. And thank you.